Hey class, long time no see in video form. We're going to continue on with the muscular system, and today is a lot less of a process, but more just kind of like explaining, one, how we provide energy for muscle contraction. So it's just a lot of tidbit information and not really a process. So let's get started. ATP, hopefully you know, is made by mitochondria. It's also made in a lot of other forms, is the energy that powers our cells. It's the only energy source that can be used directly to power muscle contraction. ATP is stored in muscle fibers in pretty small amounts, and typically whenever we're doing muscle contractions, they're used up very quickly within just a few seconds. And after this initial few seconds, other pathways have to be utilized to produce more ATP. We have to continuously make more ATP as we continuously use it to give our body energy and our muscles to move. So there are three pathways to regenerate ATP for your body. We're going to talk about each one of these separately. The first pathway is direct phosphorylation of ADP by creatine phosphate. ADP stands for adenosine diphosphate. So di means two, where ATP is adenine triphosphate, which means three. So all that happens in this process, and we're going to explain it in the next slide, is a phosphorylation is added onto ADP using creatine phosphate. The second way is aerobic pathway, which is what you guys learn in biology as aerobic respiration. And the last one is anaerobic glycolysis or lactic acid formation. So let's go through each one of these step by step. The first one we're going to talk about is direct phosphorylation of ADP by creatine phosphate, which is represented by the letter CP for short. This is actually the fastest way to make ATP. What happens is muscle cells store this compound called creatine phosphate. It's a very high energy molecule. After ATP is depleted, it leaves behind ADP because ATP has lost the phosphate. The creatine phosphate located within those muscle cells, they transfer a phosphate group that they have onto ADP. So D means di, so it transfers a phosphate. So now I have three, and it becomes ATP. Now, creatine phosphate, while it is located in the muscles and it is the fastest way to make ATP, creatine phosphate is exhausted in less than 15 seconds. So once you've exercised for 15 seconds, you have used up that supply. Also, to note, 1 ATP is produced for 1 CP molecule. So it doesn't make a very high quantity of ATP. Over here, this is a picture of direct phosphorylation. Here you have creatine phosphate, so creatine with a phosphate on it. ADP comes along and this phosphate gets transferred to ATP, and that leaves just behind creatine. Oxygen use, doesn't need it, makes 1 ATP, and it usually lasts about 15 seconds of exercise or muscle contraction. The second one is aerobic respiration. Now this supplies ATP at rest and during light and moderate exercise. In fact, it supplies about 95% of ATP used for muscle activities because we've depleted the other sources so quickly that, again, 95% come from this pathway. Aerobic respiration is defined as, so I'm going to say defined, is a series of metabolic pathways. It also goes by the name oxidative phosphorylation. Oxidative because it requires oxygen in order to add a phosphate or to add a phosphate to ATP. Now this occurs in the mitochondria of the cell, which is why they call mitochondria the powerhouse of the cell, because this is where a lot of our ATP is made. What happens is glucose that we take in, but you can also use proteins or fats, is broken down to create carbon dioxide and water, also ATP. it makes actually about 32 ATP. It's one of those processes that requires a lot of oxygen, and it output gives you a lot of ATP. The drawback of this, though, is that it's a very slow reaction, and it requires continuous oxygen and continuous supply of nutrients. And if it lacks any one of those, we can't use this pathway. Over here, here's aerobic pathway or aerobic cellular respiration that you guys learned in junior high. The energy source, you can use glucose, which is what you've learned in biology, but you could also use any kind of nutrient that gives you energy, like fats, proteins. They put amino acids in here. Okay. Again, it goes into the mitochondria, makes CO2 and water, can make 32 ATP, and it needs oxygen to happen. Before I move on to the next slide, a duration of energy provisions, it says hours. So it gives you hours of energy. Okay. Now, the last pathway we're going to talk about is anaerobic glycolysis. Anaerobic means without, aerobic without oxygen. So anaerobic glycolysis is a reaction that breaks down glucose without oxygen. This occurs in the cytosol of the cell. Now, glucose, what happens is this is the beginning stage of cellular respiration. Glucose is broken down into pyruvic acid to make 2 ATP. However, oxygen's not present, so this pyruvic acid doesn't go into the cellular respiration cycle. Instead, it's converted into lactic acid, and lactic acid has been studied to prove to cause muscle soreness. There are also other studies out there that say, hey, that's not true. That's not why your muscles feel sore. So depending on the study and who you talk to, they might say something different, but this is what our book says. This reaction is not very efficient since it only makes 2 ATP, but it is fast. In fact, it provides enough ATP for about 30 to 40 seconds of very strenuous muscle activity. Whenever you are low on oxygen, lactic acid is formed until you're able to breathe in and replenish and make more ATP through cellular respiration. The only downfall of this is a lot of glucose is needed. So if we look at the anaerobic pathway picture, our energy source is glucose. Does it require oxygen? No. It makes about 2 ATP. It actually gives about 40 seconds or slightly more time for energy. Next, we're going to talk about muscle fatigue and an oxygen deficit. If muscle activity is very strenuous and prolonged, muscle fatigue happens. The working muscle will begin to tire and it will contract less weakly or more weakly until it finally stops reacting and stops contracting. True muscle fatigue is when the muscle quits entirely, and this actually very rarely occurs in us because typically we're going to tire, our bodies are going to tell us to rest. However, they have seen true muscle fatigue happen in marathon runners where they have ran so hard that when they cross the finish line, they collapse and they physically cannot get back up. So suspected factors that contribute to muscle fatigue are ion imbalances. So there's not enough calcium and potassium, and so it's not firing at these neuromuscular junctions that we've learned about. There's also an oxygen deficit, which means there's not enough oxygen to start making ATP. It doesn't mean that there's no oxygen. There's still oxygen present. However, we're not able to take in oxygen fast enough for us to do aerobic respiration. So it starts using anaerobic as a pathway and lactic acid builds up. And since we're not able to take in enough oxygen, it decreases our ATP supply. After exercise, though, you're going to notice that your oxygen deficit, you're repaying it back when you start rapid, deep breathing. You're getting in enough oxygen, more ATP is being made to replenish it. And you notice that, hey, your body's going back and maintaining homeostasis. Now, there are different types of muscle contractions that we're also going to learn about. There are isotonic and isometric. Isotonic contractions are when your myofilaments, so remember your myofilaments are actin and myosin, they are able to slide past each other during contractions, and your muscle shortens, and usually there's movement. Good examples of this are bending a knee, lifting weights, and smiling. Isometric contractions are a little bit different. Muscle filaments try to slide past each other, but the muscle is actually pitted against an immovable object, so while they're trying to slide past each other, they can't really shorten. Muscles are still working though. Tension increases, muscles are still working, the only difference is muscles are not shortening. A good example of this is if you take your palms and press them together in front of you as hard as you can, or if you press your hands against the wall and try to push, that wall's not going to move. That brings us to muscle tone. Muscle tone is defined as a continuous partial contraction that you cannot consciously control, and they occur even when your muscles are voluntarily relaxed. You don't really notice these happen because they're partial contractions. You can't feel your body moving, but this muscle tone is very important. When muscle tone happens, different motor units are stimulated, so muscles remain firm, healthy, and they're constantly ready for action. The last thing we're going to talk about, since we've talked about ATP, is exercise, because ATP and energy and exercise go hand in hand. The amount of work muscles do changes muscles. If you are very inactive and your muscles aren't constantly used, it causes muscle weakness, your muscles waste away. Some possible causes could be loss of nerve supply or you just not moving it, not exercise, immobilization. This is a firm principle of use it or lose it. Okay. However, if you do the opposite and you exercise, this increases muscle size, strength, and endurance depending on what type of exercise you do. The first type of exercise is aerobic. So this is endurance exercise. If you're biking, you're jogging, you're running, you're walking very fast. This is going to result in muscles that are stronger, they are more flexible, and they have a greater resistance to fatigue, so you don't get tired as often. Usually during aerobic exercise, you want to get your heart rate up so your body intakes more oxygen, and your body gets used to this increase in oxygen. It has a lot of benefits. So benefits of aerobic exercise, it helps increase your blood supply. Your body also learns to store more oxygen. Your body metabolism is more efficient. You're able to break things down and build things up. It improves your digestion. It improves your coordination. And actually, it helps clear fat deposits from your blood vessel walls. So you don't have to worry about any kind of heart disease when it comes to built up fat in your blood vessels. You also have resistance, or also known as isometric exercise. Isometric or resistant exercise, a good example of this is weightlifting. This increases the muscle size and the strength. When you do resistant exercise, you're pitting your muscles against an immovable or something that is difficult to move, like weights, and that causes the individual muscle fibers to enlarge, and that's why you see an increase in your muscle mass. Whereas if you're just a runner, you don't see as big of an increase. So these are the two differences between the exercise. Again, A is going to be your endurance exercise, whereas B is going to be your resistance exercise. And that's the end of today's lesson. I went through that a little fast. Let me know if I need to go through anything with you, and ask me if you have any questions whatsoever. And I hope you guys have a great day.